On the night of February 21, 2018, the small town of Ngcobo in South Africa was calm and quiet, just like any other night. But just before midnight, everything changed. A car stopped suddenly in front of the police station. Before anyone could react, the doors of the station flew open. A group of men ran inside. Then came the gunshots. In just a few moments, 5 police officers were killed. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a random act. It was a planned attack. And the people behind it weren't gang members or criminals from the street. They were church leaders. But somehow, these men who claimed to be holy became cold-blooded killers. How did this happen? How did a place that was supposed to be a house of God become the base for such a terrible crime? This is the story of the Mancoba brothers, the 7 angels of death. Every movement has a beginning. For the 7 angels ministry, it all started with one man, Ngcobo Mancoba. He wasn't always seen as a prophet. In fact, he began as an ordinary school teacher. Quietly known in his community, Ngcobo didn't hold much power at first, but he had something few people did: a presence. His voice could calm a room. His words reached into people's deepest fears and hopes. And when he looked at you, it felt like he saw everything. The story he would tell for years to come began, as he claimed, in the late 1980s. It was during a time of great personal struggle that Ngcobo said he was visited by a divine messenger. This was not a vague feeling or a dream. He described it as a real, physical event. An angel, he said, descended from heaven and stood before him, flooding his humble room with a light that was not of this world. The angel delivered a profound and life-altering message. He told Ngcobo that the world as he knew it, the world of jobs, schools, governments, and banks, was a lie. It was a corrupt system created by Satan to enslave humanity. The angel then gave Ngcobo his divine mission. He was to create a sanctuary, a new church that would be an ark for the righteous. This church would be a refuge from the coming apocalypse, a place where true believers could separate themselves from Satan's world and prepare for their entry into heaven. He, Ngcobo Mancoba, was chosen to be the shepherd for this flock. He was given a new name and a new purpose. He was no longer just a man. He was a patriarch, a modern-day Noah tasked with saving his people from the coming flood. From this single, powerful story, the core doctrines of the 7 angels ministry were born. The teachings were simple, absolute, and deeply appealing to those who felt left behind by society. The first rule was total separation. Followers were told to reject the worldly system in its entirety. This meant they had to quit their jobs, pull their children out of school, burn their government identification documents, and close their bank accounts. These were not just institutions. They were tools of the devil, designed to keep souls tied to a doomed earth. By giving them up, believers were taking their first step toward true spiritual freedom. In their place, Ngcobo offered a new way of life, one centered entirely on God. A life lived in preparation for the end times, which, he promised, were just around the corner. Ngcobo Mancoba's message didn't fall on deaf ears. It found a home in Ngcobo, a small town tucked away in South Africa's Eastern Cape, where life was already hard and full of struggle. This wasn't just a quiet town. It was a place where dreams had been buried long ago, and where people woke up each day facing the same heavy reality: poverty, joblessness, and neglect. Ngcobo, like many towns in the Eastern Cape, had been shaped by generations of economic pain. The land was poor, the roads worn down, and the promises of a better future felt like cruel jokes. For most young people, finishing school didn't lead to a job. It didn't lead anywhere. Families survived, but just barely. There was no chance to dream, to grow, or to get ahead. This is what made Ngcobo the perfect place for a man like Ngcobo Mancoba to rise. When he spoke of the world being a lie, built by Satan to trap the poor and keep them suffering, it didn't sound strange. It sounded true. People were already living that truth. The government had failed them. The schools had failed them. Even the churches, once places of hope, now seemed to ask for more than they gave. So when Ngcobo said, "Leave it all behind," people listened. He told them they weren't poor because they were lazy. They were poor because they had not bowed to a wicked world. In his eyes, their suffering meant they were pure. Their struggle was proof of their righteousness. But Sifiwo didn't stop at preaching. He gave people something real to hold on to. He offered them a new identity. The Seven Angels ministry was more than just a church. It was a full way of life. People who joined weren't just followers. They were chosen. They became part of a spiritual family, handpicked by God to escape the destruction of the world and build something better. He promised them heaven, but he also promised them something more immediate, that they mattered, that their lives had value, that if they gave everything they had, God would give back even more. In a town where people had already lost so much, the idea of giving everything didn't feel like a sacrifice. It felt like a way out. For people who had nothing, the promise of everything was too powerful to resist. Ngcobo was ready for belief, and Sifiwo was ready to lead. As Sifiwo Mancoba's church grew, so did his own bloodline. He had 7 sons: Thandazile, Solisa, Benele, Futhumale, Filile, Maskumbule, and Ephraim. To the outside world, they were simply children. But inside the walls of the Seven Angels ministry, they were much more than that. They were seen as holy. Their followers did not view them as ordinary boys, but as something higher. These sons were the chosen ones, handpicked by God before birth, born into the world to walk beside the prophet and carry on his mission. From the very beginning, their lives were shaped to reflect that divine identity. They were not raised like other children. There were no school uniforms, no trips to the playground, no report cards. They never went to school at all. They were completely cut off from the outside world, and everything they were taught came directly from their father. Their only classroom was the church compound, and their only curriculum was the Bible, filtered through Sifiwo's extreme teachings. Books, teachers, and outside ideas were seen as tools of corruption. Everything they learned was designed to build their belief in a single truth. They were not human like everyone else. This wasn't treated as a figure of speech. It was drilled into them as a fact. They were told stories about their time in heaven before they were born. They were reminded daily that they had powers, that they were eternal beings walking among mortals. The world outside was described as broken, sinful, and ruled by Satan. The only place untouched by evil was their father's church, and they were the purest part of it. The people around them reinforced this every day. The church members served them hand and foot. They bowed to them, waited on them, and treated them like royalty. They were given special treatment, special privileges, and special titles. If they wanted something, it was handed to them. If they gave an order, it was followed. No one dared to question them. No one told them no. As the boys grew older, this belief in their own power began to harden. Their father's teachings had built them into symbols of divine authority, but they had also removed the things that made them human. They didn't grow up with empathy or humility. They didn't experience what it meant to earn respect or apologize for mistakes. They had never been challenged, never been made to feel small, and never had to consider someone else's pain. They believed they were above rules, above guilt, and above consequence. Sifiwo Mancoba had created a belief system that elevated his sons far above the rest of humanity. He had built them into angels, but not the kind that brings peace. These were the kind that brought fire. As the Seven Angels ministry expanded, it slowly pulled away from the rest of Ngcobo. The church did not just grow in numbers, it grew in land, in isolation, and in power. Up on a quiet hillside, just outside the town, a compound began to rise. It wasn't made of expensive materials or grand architecture. The buildings were simple, made from brick, wood, and corrugated metal. But what they lacked in luxury, they made up for in purpose. This was not just a church, it was a kingdom, a private world where the rules of the outside no longer applied. Over time, the compound became completely self-contained. Everything the followers needed was inside: housing, food, spiritual guidance, and even leadership. It had its own order, its own economy, and its own rhythm of life. People didn't live by clocks or calendars anymore. Their days were structured around prayer, scripture readings, chores, and sermons. Every moment belonged to God and to the men who claimed to speak for Him. By this point, Sifiwo Mancoba was no longer leading the church on his own. Age had slowed him down, and his 7 sons had taken over. They were now the center of everything. Life inside the compound followed a strict routine. Followers woke before the sun, beginning each day with group prayers. After that, they did whatever work was needed to keep the compound running. Some cleaned, others cooked, and many worked in the gardens or tended to livestock. In between, there were hours of Bible study and even longer sermons, often delivered by one of the brothers. There was no privacy, no time off, and no real rest. Every part of daily life was a form of worship and submission. Getting new members into the fold didn't happen by accident. The recruitment process was slow and careful. It usually started with a friendly invitation to attend a church service. The first impression was always the same. Newcomers were met with open arms, smiles, and a level of warmth that felt almost too good to be true. They were told they were chosen by God, that their arrival had been foreseen, and that they were finally where they belonged. This overwhelming affection had a purpose. It was a tactic known as love bombing. It made people feel seen, valued, and accepted in a way the outside world never had. And once that emotional bond was formed, the real work began. The brothers started making promises. For those who were poor, there was the promise of wealth. For the sick, there was healing. For the lonely, there was community. For the hopeless, there was salvation. It seemed like everything people had ever prayed for was finally within reach. But to receive these blessings, there was a price. New followers were slowly pressured to prove their faith. They were told that true belief required sacrifice. At first, it was small things, maybe giving up a cell phone or quitting a job. But eventually, they were asked to go further. Many sold their cars, handed over the deeds to their homes, and emptied out their life savings for the ministry. It was all done in the name of devotion. To question it would be to question God's will. The most important step was when they handed over their bank cards and social grant cards. Once that happened, they had no more control over their own money. Their government aid, their pensions, their disability checks, all of it went straight to the ministry. This was the final break from the outside world. With no money, no property, and no support system, they became fully dependent on the compound. The power the Mancoba brothers held over their followers wasn't just enforced with isolation or physical boundaries. It was built on something far more powerful. It was built on fear. And that fear came from a carefully crafted belief system that controlled every part of their followers' lives. The brothers told their followers that when the final day came, only those inside the sacred land of the ministry would be saved from the coming apocalypse. Everyone else, including family and friends outside the group, would be wiped out. This belief made it almost impossible for people to leave. They weren't just afraid of being shunned, they were afraid of dying, and even worse, they were afraid of losing their chance at salvation. Money played a huge role in all of this too. The Mancoba brothers didn't just accept donations. They taught that giving money to them was a form of worship. It wasn't about charity, it was about faith. According to their twisted version of the gospel, any money given to the ministry would be sent straight to heaven, where God would multiply it. The brothers described it like a heavenly investment. They said God had a special oven in the sky where He baked blessings, and for every single rand a follower gave, they would receive thousands back on the day of salvation. This promise created false hope. People who had nothing still gave everything. They sold their homes, emptied their savings, and handed over their social grant cards, believing they were buying their way into a future filled with riches and safety. The reality, of course, was very different. The only people getting richer were the Mancoba brothers. But nothing in their doctrine was more disturbing than how they treated women and girls. The brothers taught that because they were angels, they didn't have to follow human rules. That included marriage, relationships, and consent. They claimed they had a divine right to choose any woman or girl as their wife. They called them brides or wives. But these were not real marriages. These were forced relationships. Many of these women had no choice. Teenage girls were taken from their families and placed in the brothers' quarters. Resistance was not an option. If someone said no, they were told they were defying the will of God. To the outside world, This would have been seen as clear abuse. Inside the compound, it was framed as a spiritual honor. The women were told that carrying a child for an angel was the highest calling a woman could receive. They were brainwashed into believing it was their duty. In truth, it was organized and systematic exploitation. This horrifying system was the darkest part of the ministry. For a long time, the Seven Angels ministry looked untouchable, but even the strongest walls can't hold forever. And eventually, cracks began to form. At first, those cracks were barely visible. A few followers managed to escape the compound. They came out broken, poor, and traumatized, but they brought with them stories that painted a very different picture of the so-called holy ground. These were not just unhappy ex-members, they were survivors. They spoke of how they had been stripped of everything they owned, how their money and possessions had been handed over in the name of salvation. They described long days filled with forced prayer, mental exhaustion, and a constant fear of punishment. Worst of all, they exposed what was happening to women and girls behind closed doors. According to these accounts, the brothers lived in luxury while their followers struggled to survive. Elderly members had given up their pensions. Mothers had handed over their child support grants. And yet the compound leaders, dressed in the finest clothes, ate well, and held complete control over every detail of life. Women were told their bodies belonged to the angels. Children were kept away from the outside world. For the people who made it out, speaking the truth was not just a cry for justice, it was a warning. Still, many in the outside world refused to believe it. Some thought these stories were exaggerated or made up by bitter former members. Others simply didn't want to get involved. The compound was far away, and what happened inside seemed like someone else's problem. But there were people who started paying closer attention. Social workers became increasingly alarmed by the number of children living on the property. These children were not allowed to go to school. They were being raised in complete isolation, cut off from books, lessons, and the normal experiences of childhood. Attempts to check on their well-being were blocked. Officials who tried to visit the compound were chased off, yelled at, or threatened. The Mancoba brothers accused them of being tools of the devil, sent to poison the minds of their children. The ministry became more and more hostile to any form of outside contact. As the pressure from authorities and the public began to grow, the attitude inside the compound started to shift. The brothers, once calm and confident, now grew anxious and aggressive. Their sermons changed. No longer were they just preaching about the end of the world. Now they were talking about enemies. They claimed the government was trying to destroy them. Police officers, social workers, and even worried parents were labeled as enemies of God. They told their followers that Satan had sent an army to break their faith and steal their children. Trust in the outside world was completely destroyed. The brothers urged their people to prepare for battle, to be ready to defend themselves at all costs. The compound was no longer just a place of worship. It was turning into a fortress. What had once been a spiritual movement was now becoming something far more dangerous. The fear that had been used to keep followers obedient was now fueling anger and violence. The sense of isolation had turned into full-blown paranoia, and the men who called themselves angels were preparing for war. It was something explosive, and everyone outside the compound was about to feel the impact. By early 2018, the Mancoba brothers no longer saw the outside world as simply lost or sinful, and to fight this war, they believed they needed weapons. On the cold night of February 21, 2018, the brothers made a decision that would shock the country. Their target was the Ngcobo police station, the most visible symbol of law and state power in the area. They believed this place represented everything evil in the world, and so they decided to strike. The attack was not random. It was carefully planned and carried out by people who truly believed they were doing God's work. To the outside world, it was a violent crime. But to the Mancoba brothers and their chosen followers, it was a sacred mission. That night, they stormed into the police station with terrifying speed and confidence. There was no warning, no chance to negotiate. The 5 police officers on duty, along with a retired soldier who was visiting the station, were completely unprepared. They never stood a chance. Erupted in every direction. The attackers didn't hesitate. They moved quickly and with purpose, treating their victims as enemies, not as human beings. In just a few minutes, the station was silent. 6 men were dead, and the ground was soaked in blood. After the shooting stopped, the attackers moved through the station, taking every weapon they could find. They grabbed R5 rifles, shotguns, and pistols. This was not about robbery. This was about building an arsenal for the holy war they believed was coming. Once the armory was cleaned out, the group disappeared into the night. They returned to the compound as if they had completed a sacred ritual. Inside the walls of their kingdom, they celebrated the massacre as a victory. They believed they had dealt a powerful blow to the forces of evil. What they didn't realize was that they had just triggered the beginning of their own destruction. News of the Ngcobo massacre spread across South Africa with horrifying speed. 6 men had been down inside a police station. This wasn't just shocking, it was unthinkable. The public demanded answers, and the government wasted no time responding. A special task force was assembled immediately. Some of the country's best officers, including the elite Hawks unit, were assigned to the case. It was clear that this was no ordinary criminal act. Something much darker was behind it. Despite their confidence, the attackers had made mistakes. Witnesses, evidence, and intelligence quickly led investigators in one direction: the Seven Angels Ministry. The more they looked, the more everything pointed back to the compound on the hill. The so-called angels had committed the unthinkable, and now the time for justice had come. In the early hours of February 23rd, just 2 days after the attack, police moved in. It was still dark when dozens of officers surrounded the compound. From loudspeakers, officers called for the residents to surrender. The compound, once a place of quiet worship and strict control, had become the center of a national security crisis. Inside, the Mancoba brothers faced a choice. They could surrender and face the consequences, or they could fight. True to their beliefs, they chose war. In their minds, giving in to the police meant giving in to Satan. That morning, the battle they had preached about for years finally arrived. Broke out without warning. The compound erupted in chaos. Police returned with overwhelming force. When it was over, 7 people were dead. Among them were 3 of the Mancoba brothers, including the leader of the ministry. Their holy kingdom was in ruins. The surviving brothers, along with several of their most loyal followers, were captured. They were led away in handcuffs. Their once powerful words and divine titles meant nothing now. The war they had warned about had come and gone, and they had lost everything. The violent end of the siege was only the beginning of the next chapter. With the brothers arrested and their kingdom destroyed, it was time to uncover the truth. Court proceedings began soon after, and for the first time, the world was able to hear what really happened inside the walls of the Seven Angels Ministry. Survivors and former members began to speak. Many had spent years under the control of the brothers. Now free, they were ready to tell their stories. Their testimonies revealed a world built on lies, fear, and control. As the court listened, it became clear that this was not just a case about or stolen weapons. This was a story about deep, systematic abuse. It was about a cult that had disguised itself as a church and used faith as a weapon. In the end, the remaining Mancoba brothers and several other leaders were found guilty. They received long prison sentences. Their power was gone, their lies had been exposed, and their legacy would forever be remembered as one of pain and manipulation. The fall of the Seven Angels Ministry was complete. What began as a self-proclaimed kingdom of heaven ended as a nightmare. The courts had spoken. The victims had been heard. And the truth, no matter how horrifying, had finally come to light.